So Jesus told his disciples, don't be deceived. First, false messiahs will come and you hear of wars and rumors of wars. But that's not the end. The sign that the end has begun will be when nation rises against nation and kingdom against kingdom. That's a world war. And as confirmation, there will be an increase in magnitude and scale of earthquakes and famines. But that's only the beginning of the birth pangs. And then Jesus delivered the bad news. Verse 12. Last week we started going through the Olivet Discourse verse by verse in the Gospel of Matthew. And if you don't mind, let me give you a brief synopsis of what we covered, and then we'll pick up where we left off. First, we talked about the context in which the Olivet Discourse occurred. If you remember, Jesus officially presented himself as the Messiah on April the 6th, 32 AD, just as Daniel predicted he would in his famous 70-week prophecy. But the religious leaders rejected Jesus. And even worse, they used their influence to turn the whole nation against him. Therefore, Jesus denounced them and explained what would happen to Israel as a consequence of their actions. First, Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed and left desolate. Secondly, the Jews would be scattered all over the world. And last but not least, the kingdom of God would be taken from Israel and given unto the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles was fulfilled. Now, this was very difficult for the disciples to fathom. In fact, it actually blew their mind. So as they were leaving the Temple Mount, they pointed at the temple and all the various buildings surrounding it. And in essence, they said to Jesus, "You're telling us that all of this is going to be destroyed and left desolate." To which Jesus replied, "I tell you the truth. They will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another." Now, people, this raised all kinds of questions in their mind. So 4 of the disciples went to Jesus after they reached the top of the Mount of Olives, and they asked him 3 specific questions. Question number 1, when will the temple be destroyed, and what will be the sign that it's about to happen? Question number 2, what will be the sign of your coming? And question number 3, what's the sign that the end of this age has begun? In other words, what's the sign that the end times have begun? Now, Jesus didn't answer their questions in the order in which they asked them. In fact, the Gospel of Matthew doesn't even record Jesus' answer to the first question. Neither does the Gospel of Mark. So we're going to have to look at Luke's Gospel when we look at Jesus' answer to that question. But as we go through the Olivet Discourse, verse by verse, just keep in mind that Jesus did not answer these questions in the same order in which they were asked. Plus, he added bits of information concerning things they didn't even ask about. Now, last week we got as far as verses 7 and 8 in Matthew chapter 24, which provided the answer to their third question. What was the third question? Their third question was, what's the sign or signs that the end of the age has begun? And according to Jesus, the sign was world war. Most people miss that because of the way it's stated. Instead of just saying world war, Jesus said, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, which means the very same thing. You see, the expression, nation shall rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, is a Hebrew idiom that refers to a world war. In fact, if you don't mind, let me go a little bit deeper because this is critical. Most pastors don't understand this, and neither do seminary professors. That's why they don't get the Olivet Discourse. So let me go a little bit deeper if you don't mind. During the Old Testament period, if you wanted to convey the idea that war had broken out in a specific area and everyone in that area was affected and involved and had taken sides, you would use this idiom specifying the area and the groups involved. This idiom was meant to convey a total conflict affecting everyone in the area specified. And let me give you an example. Look with me, if you would, in the book of Isaiah chapter 19, verse number 2. Notice what it says. I will make Egyptian fight against Egyptian, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, city against city, province against province. Do you see that? This is a Hebrew idiom. This expression meant that a civil war would take place in Egypt, involving and affecting everyone in Egypt. Egyptians fighting against Egyptians, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, city against city, province against province. So, when Jesus used the expression, nation shall rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, he was referring to a world war. A war that would affect every nation and every kingdom in some way or another. So according to Jesus, the sign that would signal that the end of the age had begun was a world war. Now, what's interesting is that there has never been a world war, a war that involved every part of the world until World War I. That's why it's referred to as World War I. And most historians agree that World War II was just a continuation of World War I. Jesus also said that an increase in magnitude and scale of earthquakes and famine would confirm the sign. And those three things were the beginning of birth pangs. Everyone knows what a pang is, right? I had some pangs over the weekend. They are short, sharp pains. I didn't have any birth pangs because I'm not a female. A birth pang is a contraction. But more importantly, a contraction tells you that it's time. The baby might not come immediately, but it's coming. In other words, the contraction is the beginning of the end of the pregnancy. That's very important. That's why usually first-time fathers freak out when the wife says, I'm having contractions. Oh, you're having contractions. It's the beginning of the end of the pregnancy. So what Jesus was saying is that a world war followed by an increase in magnitude and scale of earthquakes and famine was the sign that it's time. It might not happen immediately, but it's the beginning of the end of this age. Now, before we move on, let me explain something else about the Olivet Discourse. The more you understand about it, the easier it will be to understand, especially when you compare what Matthew wrote to Luke and what those two wrote compared to Mark. So, here's what you need to understand. For the most part, the Olivet Discourse is laid out in chronological order. But when it's not, it will be clearly indicated that it's not. Now, if you don't understand this, you're going to be lost and confused as you read through the Gospels and you come to the Olivet Discourse, especially if you compare Matthew with Luke and Luke with Mark, and you start looking at these all together, you're going to be confused if you don't understand that. The Olivet Discourse is laid out in chronological order, but when it's not, it will be clearly indicated that it's not. Now, let me give you an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. Last week, we ended with verses 7 and 8 in Matthew chapter 24. So what would you expect, especially since we're going verse by verse through the Olivet Discourse? Well, you would expect for us to move on to verse 9 because we're going verse by verse. But we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to jump over to the Gospel of Luke and read verses 12 through 19. Why? Because we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. And we want to make sure that we cover everything that Jesus said in his Olivet Discourse. But if we stay in Matthew, we can't do that. You see, Matthew's account of the Olivet Discourse is laid out in chronological order. And he doesn't deviate from that until he gets down to verse number 32. Once he gets down to verse number 32, and especially verse 36, he deviates from that. But that's almost to the end of the chapter. Therefore, since he started with the sign of the end of the age, he proceeds on with the next set of events, which deals with the tribulation. So if we went to the very next verse, verse number 9, we would be looking at what Jesus said about the tribulation, the 70th week of Daniel. Because he's trying to the best of his ability to keep everything in chronological order. So he just leaves out certain things that Jesus said. It's not included. Luke, on the other hand, recorded the part that Matthew left out because he didn't care if his rendition flowed in chronological order. He was more concerned about including everything that Jesus said. So at times, Luke's rendition of events doesn't flow in chronological order. But when it doesn't, it's clearly indicated. That's important to know. You need to pay attention to those conjunctions because it's clearly indicating it's not flowing in chronological order. Now, let me show you what I'm talking about. Look at Matthew chapter 24, verses 7 through 9, and then we're going to compare it to Luke chapter 21, verses 10 through 12. If we went a little further, we would see that Matthew and Luke's account, up until about verse 9 in Matthew and verse 12 in Luke, they're the very same. But in verse 9 and verse 12, they're totally different. So, let's look at Matthew chapter 24, verses 7 and 9, and then we're going to compare it to Luke chapter 21, verses 10 through 12. Here's Matthew chapter 24, verses 7 through 9. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs, the beginning of the end of this age. Then, notice that word then. I have it bold-faced and I have it underlined. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations on account of my name. Now I want you to notice that word then. Then is translated from the Greek word tate, and it implies after that, then. We don't insert after that, we just say then. And as a result, in English, many times we see then, but we don't really think about what that means. What it means is after that, after the end of this age has begun, then. All right? In other words, after the world war and the end of the age has begun, then they will deliver you over to tribulation. So Matthew continues on in chronological order, but as we're going to see, Luke doesn't. Look at Luke chapter 21, verses 10 through 12, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Then he continued by saying to them, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes, and in various places plagues and famines. Almost word for word what Matthew said. Now notice this, verse 12. But before all these things, not after, but before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and will persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. Now, do you see that first part of verse 12? But before all these things, pra-did-taton penton. In other words, but before the end of the age has begun, and even before the false messiahs appear, and wars and rumors of war, here's what's going to happen. So Luke records something that Matthew doesn't. In Luke's rendition of the Olivet Discourse, Jesus backtracks and he tells the apostles what they should expect in their lifetime. This is what's going to happen to you. And that's why we're jumping over to the Gospel of Luke, because he included something in his rendition that Matthew didn't. Is everyone with me? Good. In fact, let me give you a little tip to help you understand the Olivet Discourse if you're comparing Matthew's rendition to Luke's. Matthew's account, as I've already mentioned, is in chronological order for the most part. And it's laid out in chapter 24 like this. Verses 1 and 2 is the historical setting. This is the content in which the Olivet Discourse occurred. They rejected Jesus as the Messiah. He makes the comment that Jerusalem and the temple is going to be destroyed and left desolate. The disciples can't understand that. They said, "Are you sure? Look at this, Jesus." And Jesus said, "Surely I tell you the truth. Not one stone won't be left on another." Wow. Verses 1 and 2, the historical setting. Verse 3, the three questions. So they came to Jesus and they asked three questions. Verses 4 through 6, these are the general characteristics of the church age. In other words, these are not signs. False messiahs will come. Jesus was the very first Jew that ever claimed to be the Messiah. After him, many Jews came, claiming to be the Messiah. So, he said false messiahs will come. Then he said there will be wars and rumors of wars. But the end is not yet. These are just things that's going to happen during this 2,000-year church age period. Verses 7 through 8 is the sign of the end of this age, which is what? Nation shall rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And it's going to be confirmed by an increase in magnitude and scale of earthquakes and famine. Now, here's what you need to know. Taking notes, write this down. Verses 9 through 28 is about the Great Tribulation, the 70th week of Daniel. The last 7 years, which culminates with Jesus returning. Now, if you break that down even further, verses 9 through 14 is the first half. Is the first half of the tribulation. Verses 15 through 28 is the second half of the tribulation. If you're writing this down, when you read through it, you'll understand it. Verses 29 through 30 is the sign of the second coming of Jesus Christ. Why is the second coming and the rapture two different events? Because the rapture is imminent. There is no sign that occurs before the rapture. One day we're thinking that everything's okay, and the next moment we're gone. But with the second coming of Jesus Christ, there will be a sign that everyone on this earth will see. Verse 31 is the regathering of Israel. Verse 32 is where Matthew deviates, because Jesus is finished with the Olivet Discourse. Now he's going to be adding things because he's been talking about the end of the age, what's going to happen in the end times. So verses 32 through 35 is the parable of the fig tree. He's told you when the end of the age will begin, but it's not going to happen immediately. So he goes a little bit further and he says, how will you know if you're the final generation? How do we know that if we live long enough, we will see the return of Jesus Christ? That's the parable of the fig tree. Verses 36 through 42. Almost every scholar disagrees with me on this. There's a few that doesn't. But verses 36 through 42 is the rapture. Now this is where Matthew deviates from placing the events in chronological order. But he clearly indicates that he's breaking the pattern. And I'll talk more about that when we get there. Now, Luke's account, in all probability, is closer to the way that Jesus delivered his message. Let me say this again. When we're talking, many times we don't put things in chronological order because maybe it's like, okay, we're talking about this, but here's something you need to understand. So we'll throw this in here and then we'll continue on. So Luke's rendition, in all probability, is probably closer to what Jesus actually said. But it's more difficult to follow if you don't know Greek. And I hate to say that. And the reason I hate to say that is because I've said this before. 99% of the Bible you can understand without a knowledge of the original languages. You can just sit down and you can read the Bible in English. And it doesn't matter which version you're using, whether it's King James, which is a little bit harder to understand, New American Standard, NIV. And you can understand the Bible. But 1% of the Bible, if you don't have a knowledge of Greek, then you're not going to understand it. And Luke is more difficult to follow if you don't know Greek. Now, that's not a problem for me, but it's a problem for most people. But that's why we're using Matthew's account, if at all possible, and we're only going to Luke's account when necessary. We're using Luke's account to supplement what Matthew wrote. By the time we're finished, you'll get all of Matthew's in chronological order. We've supplemented it with Luke. And if you understand what I'm saying, you can read both accounts and you have a great grasp of what Jesus was teaching in the end times. And let me say this. Very few scholars, very few professors actually understand what Jesus was talking about in the end times. And I'll tell you why. The majority of people do not interpret the Bible literally. And if you don't interpret the Bible literally, then you just get crazy. Jesus said what he meant, and he meant what he said. And here's what I've never understood. All of the messianic prophecies about Jesus concerning his first coming, Jesus fulfilled them literally. Why do we think he's not going to fulfill the messianic prophecies about his second coming literally? I don't get that. He fulfilled all of the messianic prophecies about his first coming literally, down to the smallest detail. And you're trying to tell me that when we look at the messianic prophecies about his second coming, he's not going to do that? People, he's going to do that. Now, having said all of that, let's read Luke chapter 21, verses 12 through 19 again. But before all this occurs, prode tauton penton. Pra means before, de means but, tauton these things, penton all. You don't actually have to have them in order. There's a reason for where the order, I won't go into Greek grammar, but basically it says in the Greek, but before all these things. Yeah. But before all this occurs, there will be a time of great persecution. You will be dragged into synagogues and prisons, and you will stand trial before kings and governors because you are my followers. Boy, we see that carried out, don't we, with Peter and Paul? But this will be your opportunity to tell them about me. So don't worry in advance about how to answer the charges against you. For I will give you the right words and such wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to reply or even refute you. Even those closest to you, your parents, brothers, relatives, and friends will betray you. They will even kill some of you. Oh yeah. Most of you don't know this. The apostle whom Jesus loved was John. I'm always surprised to find out that many pastors don't know that John's father was a close personal friend of the high priest. That's why John was able to go in the high priest's court when he was following Jesus, when he was arrested. It's because the servant girl knew him. He'd been to the house several times with his father. But his father didn't become a believer. Mother did. Not father. They will even kill some of you. And everyone will hate you because you're my followers. But not a hair of your head will perish. By standing firm, you will win your souls. Now, people, let's be honest. This is not good news for the disciples. In essence, Jesus is telling the apostles that they won't get to see the Lord's return in their lifetime. They won't even get to see the beginning of the end of the age. Because all of this happens before all these things occur. Pros, de, tauton, penton. Yeah. Look back at the first part of verse 12. But before all this occurs, there will be a time of great persecution. Now, what does all this refer to? It refers to everything that Jesus discussed in the Olivet Discourse. So in essence, Jesus is telling his apostles something that they didn't want to hear. They wanted to hear that the end times would begin shortly. Yes, in just a few short months or maybe a few short years, the 70th week of Daniel will begin, the last 7 years. And they wanted to hear that Jesus would return and he would usher in the Messianic age in the very near future. But that's not the way it was going to happen. It was all because Israel rejected Jesus as the Messiah. Therefore, the kingdom would be taken from Israel, would be given unto the Gentiles, until the time of the Gentiles was fulfilled. And then what Ezekiel prophesied, because they had been in captivity, coming out, they hadn't repented, then their years of servitude to God stretched out to 2,520 years. So Jesus told his disciples, don't be deceived. First, false messiahs will come and you hear of wars and rumors of wars. But that's not the end. The sign that the end has begun will be when nation rises against nation and kingdom against kingdom. That's a world war. And as confirmation, there will be an increase in magnitude and scale of earthquakes and famines. But that's only the beginning of the birth pangs. And then Jesus delivered the bad news. Verse 12. But before all this occurs, there will be a time of great persecution. In other words, this is your reward for being a follower of me. Whoa! Jesus. And all the apostles experienced everything that Jesus said. And the reason we know that is because the book of Acts tells us so. Now, we're not going to go into detail because you can do that on your own. Instead, we want to concentrate on what Jesus had to say about the end times. But if you want to go back and look at what Jesus said the disciples would have to face, study that section. I'm more concerned about the end times. I just wanted to tell you what it was about. Jesus added this because I think, in a sense, he was heartbroken for his disciples because they hadn't rejected him. But because the leaders had, and they influenced most of the nation to reject Jesus, they still had to pay the consequences. That's the way life works. Sin doesn't just affect us. It affects those around us and those that we love. We see that here in America. The godly and the righteous have to suffer just like everyone else, even though they're not responsible for what's taking place. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego still had to go into the Babylonian captivity even though they were righteous. So did Ezekiel. Jeremiah kept trying to tell them, you need to submit. This is God's will. Look at all he had to put up with. That's the way this sinful world works. And these disciples heard something they didn't want to hear. You don't get to see the Messianic age ushered in. It will not happen in your lifetime. And for us, it hadn't happened 2,000 years. And what's so sad is people go, well, they've always been saying Jesus is going to return. But we're the final generation. And I'll prove that to you when we get to verse 32. Now, in this section, verses 20 through 24, we're now going to move on. We just finished reading up to verse number 19. In verses 20 through 24 in Luke chapter 21, in this section, Jesus is going to answer the first question that the disciples asked. How many of you remember what the first question was? The first question was, when will the temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign that it's about to happen? You see, in their mind, if the temple was destroyed, that must have meant the end was near, but it really had nothing to do with the end. But it was still a major player because that's when the time of the Gentiles began. They're going to trample down the city until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. So, the first question was, when will the temple be destroyed and what will be the sign that is about to happen? Now, here's what's interesting. As I've already mentioned, Luke is the only gospel that records Jesus' answer to this question. Matthew and Mark don't mention it at all. So let's read verses 20 through 24 in Luke chapter 21. And when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you will know that the time of its destruction has arrived. Then those in Judea must flee to the hills, those in Jerusalem must get out, and those out in the country should not return to the city. For those will be days of God's vengeance, and the prophetic words of the scriptures will be fulfilled. How terrible it will be for pregnant women and for nursing mothers in those days. For there will be disaster in the land and great anger against this people. They will be killed by the sword or sent away as captives to all nations of the world. And Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Gentiles until the period of the Gentiles comes to an end. Now, Jesus went into quite a bit of detail in answering their question. First, he gave them the sign that signaled that Jerusalem, the temple, was about to be destroyed. Look at verse number 20 again. And when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you will know that the time of its destruction has arrived. That's the sign that it's about to happen. Jerusalem would be surrounded by armies. And Jesus told his followers that when they saw this sign, they were to leave Jerusalem and Judea immediately and flee. Look at verse 21. Those in Jerusalem must get out, and those out in the country should not return to the city. Now let me ask you a question. Once the city was surrounded by armies, they were trapped. So how could they leave? Jesus said, when you see it surrounded by armies, get out of the city. But once it's surrounded by armies, you're trapped. Once they saw the sign, wasn't it too late to leave? Well, let me explain what happened, because exactly what Jesus said came to pass. And it's always amazing to me how every little detail comes to pass. In 66 AD, the Jews revolted against the Romans. And the Roman general that was stationed in Israel at the time, Cestus Gallus, brought his army up from Caesarea and surrounded the city. When he surrounded the city, that was the sign that Jesus had promised. But here's what's interesting. A few days later, Cestus Gallus realized that his supply line was not secure. So he withdrew his army and he went back to Caesarea, which allowed thousands of Christians to flee the city. They saw all these armies surrounding the city and they said, that's the sign. But the next question is, how do we flee? And miraculously, about a week later, these armies pack up and they leave and go back to Caesarea. Now, Cestus Gallus was attacked and killed on his way back to Caesarea. A band of rebels attacked, they killed the general, and once he was killed, Rome sent another general by the name of Vespasian and his son Titus. In 68 AD, they besieged the city, and it fell in 70 AD. Altogether, over 1,100,000 Jews were killed in the final onslaught. If you count the ones that were killed during it, it was probably close to 1.5 million. Now, you'll have historians, archaeologists, you'll have different ones that will say, well, it couldn't have been that many. Jerusalem wasn't that big of a city. Well, what took place was when Vespasian and Titus came, it was Passover. Everyone from Israel had come. They surrounded the city with Passover. No one could leave. Here's what's interesting. Well, let me just say this. Anyone who survived was taken captive and they were sold into slavery. And exactly what Jesus said. All of these Jews were sold all over the world. But here's what's interesting. Supposedly, not one Jewish believer died because they obeyed the words of Jesus. When the city was surrounded, they waited for the opportunity to leave. About a week later, when Cestus Gallus left, they fled. And when Cestus Gallus was killed, most of them fled to the city of Pella. Yeah. And what today is modern-day Jordan. In Pella, they set up a Jewish synagogue and they began teaching that Jesus was the Messiah. And they waited for the prophecy of Jesus to be fulfilled, which of course it was, down to the smallest detail. But their leaving created a huge rift between the Messianic Jews and the unbelieving Jews. You see, up until 70 AD, Jewish Christians were seen as a sect of Judaism. Now, they were still persecuted. People didn't speak well of the way, but they were looked on as a sect. If you remember when Paul's talking to some of the Romans, he's talking to them, so, well, we've heard about this. We've heard of the way. And we hear that people are talking against them. But they were still considered to be a sect of Judaism. But after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, the unbelieving Jews wanted to completely separate from the Jewish believers. And I'm going to talk about that for a second because most of us don't understand why, if the majority of the Christians in the early days after Jesus was resurrected, if the majority of Christians were Jewish, how in the world did that separate to the point now, if you're a Jewish believer, you're not considered to be a true Jew? How did that happen? Well, let me explain a few things. Once Vespasian surrounded the city, no one was allowed to go in or leave, unless, of course, they were surrendering. And the zealots who were in control of Jerusalem at the time, they weren't allowing anyone to surrender. If you were going to surrender, they just go ahead and put you to death. We're not going to allow you to be used as captives to build siege ramps against us. So if you want to surrender, well, we'll just kill you. And that's what they were doing. Well, there was an old influential rabbi by the name of Yohanan ben Zakkai. Let me say that again. Yohanan ben Zakkai. He was not a zealot. And he believed that the Romans would conquer the city and punish the Jews, possibly even destroying the temple. He had heard what the Jewish Christians had said before they left Jerusalem. Yeah. And his main concern was to make sure that Judaism survived, even if Israel as a nation didn't and the temple didn't. So he and his followers devised a plan. This is all historical fact. Some of his students went to the leaders in Jerusalem and they told them that their great rabbi had died. And they asked permission to bury him outside the walls, which they received. So the rabbi was placed in a coffin and carried outside the city. Once they were within a Roman-occupied area, the rabbi rose out of his coffin and he was taken to Vespasian. Vespasian knew of the old rabbi, and he knew he was very influential, and he thought, you know what? I might be able to use him to gain influence with some of the moderates, so he listened to his request. And he was shocked by the request, because all the rabbi wanted was permission to open a school in a little village called Yavne. So he and his followers were allowed to leave, and they set up a rabbinical school in Yavne. And the objective of the school was to develop a way to worship God without the temple. You see, what most of us don't realize is the Mosaic law centered around the temple. The sacrifices, the offerings, everything centered around the temple. So if the temple's destroyed, how in the world do we keep the Mosaic law without the temple? So Yohanan ben Zakkai and his followers, they went to Yavne, and what they did is they set up a rabbinical school, and their objective was to develop a way for them to be able to worship God without the temple. And that's really the birth of what we call today rabbinical Judaism. If you're reading a book today and you hear about rabbinical Judaism, most of you think back to the time of Jesus and you think, well, you know, rabbinical Judaism, they had rabbis. Jesus was a rabbi. And it's true. But that's not the term that scholars use for rabbinical Judaism. It simply means they had rabbis. Rabbinical Judaism wasn't established until after the temple was destroyed. And basically what rabbinical Judaism is, it's the belief that you can still serve God and keep the Mosaic law without the temple. So they had to develop a system in which they were seen to be faithful to God without the temple. But another objective of the school was to save Judaism by excommunicating all Jewish Christians from Judaism, because they saw Christianity as a threat. Number one, there was a lot of animosity because all of the Christians, when they saw the army surrounding Jerusalem, they split. They got out of Dodge. And not one of them died. But secondly, all of these Gentiles were accepting Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And even worse, the leaders of this sect were telling them they didn't have to keep the Mosaic law. They didn't have to be circumcised. Didn't matter what they ate or drank. Yeah. And as a result of this, they thought the only way that we can save Judaism is if we can excommunicate these Christian Jews and separate them from Judaism. Yeah. So, they developed a benediction within the 18 benedictions that would identify Christians and enforce them out of the synagogue. You see, one of the things that they did to replace the temple, in the temple you started off the day with the sacrifices. You also did it in the middle of the day, and you also did it to end the day. Well, that's why Daniel and all of them prayed 3 times a day. You couldn't go to the temple, so what did you do? You prayed during those times. So rather than offer up sacrifices, you offered up the sacrifices of prayer. Well, they had 18 benedictions that they would offer up every morning and at noon and at the end of the day. So they developed a benediction within these 18 benedictions that would identify Christians and would force them out of the synagogue. This benediction is known as the minim benediction. Minim is a generic term for heretic, but in that day it clearly referred to Jewish Christians. And if you were suspected of being a Christian and you came to the synagogue, they would force you during the prayer time to read the benedictions in the synagogue. And of course, Christian Jews had a problem with that. Yeah. They didn't have a problem with that until they got to the Birkat HaMinim, one of the benedictions that they'd added to it. It's known as the benediction of the heretic. Let me read it to you if you don't mind. Here's what it said. For the apostates, let there be no hope, and uproot the kingdom of arrogance, speedily and in our days. May the Nazarenes, who's the Nazarenes? Jesus was from where? Nazareth. One of the common words used to refer to Christians. And remember, Christian was a new term, first given to them at Antioch. It means like Christ. You had these people trying to live like Christ, and they would call them Christians. They're trying to be like Christ. But you also referred to them as Nazarenes because they follow the man from Nazareth. And believe it or not, Nazareth had a bad connotation to it, so they thought that that was kind of derogatory, so they would refer to Christians as Nazarenes. So notice what it says. May the Nazarenes and the sectarians, in the Hebrew it's minim, and it referred to Christians just to make sure they understood. May the Nazarenes and the sectarians perish as in a moment. Let them be blotted out of the book of life and not be written together with the righteous. You are praised, O Lord, who subdues the arrogant. Now, of course, Christians would get to that benediction, the 12th one, actually added to it, and they couldn't recite that benediction because they would be placing a curse upon themselves. And they didn't believe that at all. They believed that because they were Nazarenes, part of the way, Christians, followers of Jesus Christ, they believed that their name was written in the book of life. So they couldn't quote this. As a result, they were identified as a Christian and they were excommunicated from the synagogue. But a lot of this animosity was fueled by the fact that they had fled Jerusalem before it was destroyed in 70 AD. And what's interesting, this is interesting. I dare say most of you didn't know this. Before 70 AD, as many as 20% of all Jews in Israel were Christians. Yeah. The majority of Christians in the early church, the first 10 years. In fact, Peter talks about what we consider to be the very first Gentile convert. Before that time, they were all Jews. Yeah. So scholars estimate that before 70 AD, almost 20% of all Jews were Christians. But excommunicating them out of the synagogue stopped the growth of Christianity within Judaism. But not only that, it created the mindset that a true Jew doesn't believe in Jesus. Only Gentiles do. And people, that's held today. If you talk to someone about Jesus Christ and they're Jew, they go, I'm a Jew. I'm a Jew. Jews do not believe that Jesus is for them. They believe that Jesus is for Gentiles. And here's what's interesting. It traces all the way back to Yavne, to the school set up by Yohanan ben Zakkai. Yeah. Now, I've deviated from our study on the Olivet Discourse. And the reason I deviated because I thought it was interesting. Did anyone else think it was interesting? Anyways. And I have the microphone, so if I think it's interesting, I'm going to talk. So, Jesus answered their first question, Luke chapter 21, verses 20 through 24. And he also told them that Jerusalem would be trodden down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. It's kind of interesting. If you go to Jerusalem today, Israel controls the Temple Mount. But they've turned over the authority to the Palestinians. Yeah. I am probably the only pastor in the state of Oklahoma that's been kicked off the Temple Mount. Do you know I was kicked off the Temple Mount? On one of my trips over to Israel, I had a little bit of time before we went to the airport. So I had on a pair of shorts and I trucked it over to Jerusalem and went up to the Temple Mount. And I entered through the Muslim quarters. And they didn't catch me. And I'm about 30 minutes up there and they come to me and they say, excuse me, because I have shorts on. You can't be up here. Now they wanted to sell me pants. But I'd already seen what I wanted. I said no, and they said, we're kicking you off. So I was escorted off of the Temple Mount. But I want you to understand something. The Jews are in control of Jerusalem, but it's still being trampled underfoot by the nations. The Palestinians are the ones that's up there because of the Golden Dome of the Rock and also Al-Aqsa, the other Muslim place up there. But anyways, I've deviated. Let me get back to this. So Jesus answered their first question, Luke chapter 1, verses 20, and he told them that Jerusalem is going to be trodden down by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Look back at verse 24. And Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Gentiles until the period of Gentiles comes to an end. What we find in the book of Revelation, if you've gone through my Revelation series, you know that even when the temple is rebuilt, the Dome of the Rock is still up there, and so is Al-Aqsa, the mosque on the Temple Mount. Why? Because it's not until Jesus returns that Jesus sets it up, and it will no longer be that. The time the Gentiles will be fulfilled. Yeah. So, kind of answer my own question. When does the time of Gentiles, when does it end? Well, it ends when Jesus returns to usher in the Messianic age. Yeah. But all of those things don't really deal with the end. And next week we'll come and we'll get back into what Matthew says, and we'll start looking at what Jesus said about the end times. Let's stand. I know I give you a lot of background information, but the reason it's important is because so many of us don't understand the Bible, and we don't understand where we are today. What's caused this rift between Christianity and Judaism? And I'll be honest with you, Christianity did the worst thing they could have done. When Judaism spurned them, when it started excommunicating them out of the synagogue, well, the Christians in turn did the very same thing, and they became anti-Semitic. And that's how the church has been for almost 2,000 years. But let me tell you something. The Jews are still God's chosen people. He's not returning until they say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. But the tribulation is going to cause them to seek Jesus. And when they seek Jesus and they call upon him because they realize he was and is the Jewish Messiah, that's when Jesus returns. Zechariah tells us that. But let me just say this. I said this last week. We won't be here for most of this if we're born again, if we're a Christian, if we've accepted Jesus, he's Lord of our life, because we'll be raptured. When we get to verse number 36, we'll see what Jesus had to say about it. But let me say this. You're going to have one chance and one chance only to miss the tribulation. And if you miss that one chance, you're trapped. You're trapped. That's what Jesus taught in the Olivet Discourse. And you don't want to be trapped. So that's why after every service I come up here and say, if you've never made Jesus Lord of your life, if you've never put your faith in him as your Lord and Savior, you need to do that. Because without that, you're not going to heaven when you die. And without that, when that one chance comes, the rapture occurs, if Jesus isn't Lord of your life and you're not saved, you're not going to be raptured. You're going to be left behind. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to put your faith in Jesus and make him Lord of your life. I want everyone here to bow their heads, close their eyes. And if you want to make Jesus Lord of your life, if you want to put your faith in him, if you want to know that you're going to heaven when you die, if you want to know that when the rapture occurs, you're going to escape the things that Jesus talks about and Revelation talks about, And what you need to do is repeat this prayer. The prayer is not magic, but if you believe what you're saying, your sins will be forgiven, Jesus will become your Lord, and you'll get to go to heaven with Jesus. So, all you've got to do is repeat this prayer. You can even do it silently yourself. If you're at home watching, I encourage you to say this prayer if you've never done it. Here goes. God, I know I'm a sinner, and I know that my sin has separated me from you. But God, I believe you love me. And because you love me, you sent your son Jesus as the Messiah to suffer and die for me, to pay the penalty for my sin. And I believe Jesus did that on the cross, but I also believe his soul went to hell to pay the penalty. And when all my sin was paid for, God, I believed you raised Jesus from the dead. Jesus, I want you to be Lord of my life. Forgive me for my sin. Forgive me for not making Jesus Lord. Today, I change that. Jesus, I confess you as my Lord. Thank you for saving me.